He was admired and hated, but the man behind the facade of the revolutionary leader remained a great unknown entity. Who was Fidel Castro? Fidel Castro came from the world of the large landowner. His father had an affair with the cook. She gave birth to Fidel in 1926. He grew up with his brother Raúl in luxury, and yet he was different from the rest.
At school, I developed a rebellious attitude against injustice. Several times during my childhood, I experienced things that I felt were very unfair. I experienced these kinds of things over and over again. Hence, one can say that these experiences at school made me rebellious.
Aproximadamente 3 veces sentí la sensación de cosas que me parecían injustas y que estimularon en mí un sentimiento de rebeldía.
Fidel was raised Catholic, attended a Jesuit school, and transferred from there to university in the capital. Behind its beautiful facade, Havana was a hotbed of vice for the prudish Americans in those days, dominated by corrupt governments and by the mafia. A large part of the population, however, lived in poverty. Again, Castro was outraged, this time about the wrongs that others suffered. The law student denounced the corruption and called on Cubans to be proud of their nation. A leftist nationalist, a hothead, a man women liked, Castro developed a sense of what people wanted to hear. A populist was born. Castro's plan was bold. He wanted to overthrow Batista, the dictator who ruled Cuba as an American colony and cashed in together with the mafia. Santiago de Cuba, July 1953. It's Carnival, and Castro believes that the military is not so vigilant now. With a troop of scantily armed followers, Castro wants to take the Moncada Barracks, the second largest garrison of Cuba, and trigger a national uprising. The attack fails. The military captures most of the troops, and more than half will be massacred. Fidel Castro has overestimated his strength. He himself escapes a hail of bullets until he is caught and thrown into prison. From there, he organizes the reconstruction of his troops and writes tender letters to Nadi, his new love.
Our relationship was sentimental, passionate, and more intellectual than other relationships.
Intelectual que otro tipo de relación.
After 1.5 years, Castro is released. At his reception, Murta is missing, as the marriage had been annulled. Nadi picks him up. Death threats are forcing Castro into exile in Mexico, but first he spends passionate days with Nadi. A year later, Alina is born. It takes a long time for Castro to accept his daughter. Since her falling out with her father, she's lived in Florida.
For all his appreciation of women, he is very impatient.
He
does not like it when women control him, dominate him, or try to influence him. Those techniques that women generally tend to use. But he himself understands very well how to direct the baser instincts of people.
November 56. Castro returns from exile with 81 guerrilla fighters on a shipwrecked boat armed. 1959. The hour of the victor. Commander Fidel Castro is looking for new headquarters. After years in the mountains, he considers a luxury hotel to be appropriate. There, he shows himself to the American television audience in pajamas.
This week, Fidel, as everyone in Cuba calls him, has been away in the hill country, where he made his home for 2 years. A few hours ago, he returned to his apartment on the 23rd floor of the Havana Hilton Hotel. Good evening, Fidel Castro. Tell me, Fidel Castro, are you concerned at all about the communist influence in Cuba?
Oh, I am not worried because really there is not threat about communism here in Cuba.
4 months later, Castro flies to New York at the invitation of American publishers. He has no idea that the US government had recently discussed his assassination. Castro is affable. He has nothing to do with communism, he reiterates. That goes down well with the New Yorkers. Castro has become a master of self-promotion. The revolutionary leader bows to Lincoln, the former US president, because he stands for freedom. But Washington gives Castro the cold shoulder. US President Eisenhower prefers to play golf. The guest is dispatched by his Vice President Nixon. The pride of the Cuban is deeply wounded. Castro does not feel he is being taken seriously. Nixon ridicules him as naive. The Cuban will return the favor to the United States.
Comrades, I ask you to please calm down. To be as calm as possible. That's no way to lead a revolution.
The following year, Castro returns, this time to the United Nations, and he must find accommodation in Harlem in a flophouse. Castro had meanwhile nationalized larger states and branches of US corporations in Cuba. This is something that no one has dared to do in the backyard of the United States. Another powerful leader knows how to take advantage of the tensions between his delegation and the US. No one in those days in New York is so kind to the dynamic revolutionary leaders as Nikita Khrushchev, the communist leader from Moscow. April 1961. Cuban exiles supported by the CIA want to overthrow Castro, the Bay of Pigs invasion, but Castro fights them off. As a commander, he is in his element. Now he declares his country a socialist state. The Americans react like at the touch of a button. The CIA and Cuban exiles carry out acts of sabotage. Even Castro himself is still in its sights. He learns to live with the risk, always changing his whereabouts, sealing off his private life. Help comes from the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1962, it secretly ships nuclear missiles to Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
When American spy planes discovered the launching pads, the world comes to the brink of nuclear war. The American fleet encircles the island of Cuba. Castro calls on his countrymen to prepare for an invasion. The old game continues. Little Cuba versus the USA, its big neighbor. But then the Soviets withdraw their nuclear missiles. Castro is furious. Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement behind his back. Previously, Castro had demanded a nuclear first strike in case of an invasion. Khrushchev's deputy is to bring him to his senses. He describes Castro as difficult, exploding at the slightest provocation. An invitation by Khrushchev is to improve relations. For 40 days, Castro travels through the Soviet Union. Reluctantly, he must realize that he has long been dependent on Moscow, militarily and economically, at the mercy of the world powers. A trimmed-down rebel. Here, Castro learns from Khrushchev how the horse trading with Kennedy transpired. The withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba against the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey. Henceforth, Castro also distrusts the Russians, and they distrust him, find him guerrilla-like, unpredictable. In the fall of '63, Kennedy welcomes a French journalist. He knows that he will then travel on to Cuba and gives him a message for Castro.
He told me, "You're traveling to Cuba? The whole world thinks I've got something against Castro because he's a communist. But that's not true. I couldn't care less."
Danielle delivers Kennedy's words to Castro.
Castro told me, "You know, you're a peace ambassador." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because what you told me tonight shows that Kennedy, who wanted to kill me, has changed his mind. And me, with my relationship that I had with the Russians, I've changed my mind too. Perhaps there is a chance to come to an understanding with this man.
It is November 22nd. At the same time, 1,500 kilometers northwest of here, President Kennedy and his wife are visiting Dallas.
Castro wanted to send me back to Kennedy. Suddenly the phone rang. You could understand what Castro was saying. Injured. Seriously injured. Seriously. Very seriously injured. But he's not dead. No, he's not dead. Ten minutes later, Cuba's president calls saying Kennedy is dead. Castro tells me, your peace mission is over. Now the whole world will believe I was behind the assassination, although Kennedy could have been the first US president that we could communicate with.
Kennedy's successor shows no interest in easing relations with Havana. Henceforth, Castro remains a stone in the shoe of all American presidents. Richard Nixon even takes the enmity with Fidel Castro personally. Kennedy had accused Nixon of tolerating thousands of murders and the exploitation of Cuba by the Batista regime, and thus bringing Castro to power in the first place. In Cuba, meanwhile, life follows its socialist course. Castro and Che Guevara continue to tinker on their vision of the new man and of Cuba as a model third world country. The two present themselves as a revolutionary dream team, but the kinship felt by Guevara's daughter also leads to tensions.
I think my Uncle Fidel is a very stubborn man. If he wants to push something through, he can go to extremes. And I think my father was the same.
The relationship between number one, the Maximo leader, and his minister of industry deteriorates. The sugar harvests are dwindling. Industrialization stagnates. As Che Guevara also accuses the Soviet Union of imperialism, he is removed from power. He disappears to Bolivia, instigates a guerrilla war there. But this suicide mission does not have a happy ending. Che Guevara is murdered. How Fidel Castro tells Guevara's daughter about his death shows his conviction. It is an honor to die for the revolution. During these years, Castro gets on well with the new Soviet leader Brezhnev. In Africa, he fights proxy wars for him. He also values Erich Honecker. Castro receives how on national security and economic aid from the GDR. Cubans are better off in the 70s and 80s than ever before. Countless assassination attempts. Fidel Castro has survived them all. He has his people under control. He has gained the respect of his enemies, and he disarms reporters with the greatest of ease. Spring of 1989. The Cold War is almost over. Gorbachev comes to visit. The whole world expects the Soviet leader to demand reforms. As he tells Honecker, life punishes those who come too late. But Gorbachev restrains himself. He knows why Castro became a hardliner. In the 90s, too, Washington maintains its economic blockade erected since the 1960s and achieved the opposite effect. Castro uses the pressure from the U.S. to stabilize his power in Cuba. Then, in 2004, Castro topples, physically. His supporters sense even Castro's omnipotence is finite. And in 2006, a serious intestinal surgery confines him to his sickbed. He is now tenaciously trying to keep his revolution on track from there and get back on his feet again. Early 2007, Raúl Castro is now appointed successor to his brother. But the elderly Fidel does not want to see himself forced into retirement. With occasional comments and public gestures, he wants to make it clear that he and Raúl are one. But what will become of Cuba without Fidel Castro? Raúl Castro, Cuba's new and powerful man, has also learned his lesson. The revolution needs heroes, and Cuba needs Fidel as a legend. And Raúl has launched a tentative opening towards a controlled market economy. Cuba is, and must be, more independent. At the end of his life, he is also seeking his peace with God. In the 90s, he's a very successful politician. In 2012, Castro and his girlfriend Dalia welcome Pope Benedict XVI. The result of decades of Castro's rule, any opposition in Cuba has no chance. Instead, hero worship according to the Soviet model. For decades, Cuba's spiritual life was restricted. This large landowner should have left his finger to younger people a long time ago. But Castro had changed his fate to that of Cuba, and vice versa. But in one thing, he seemed different. Castro lived modestly. As a video that was smuggled out of Cuba and aired by U.S. channel shows, the ladies' man and father of at least 8 grown children, in a late role as grandpa. Buenos Aires, 2003. Even after half a century in power, Castro was specially celebrated in the developing world as a heroic figure. His last appearances were similar to those of a pop star on a farewell tour. Fidel Castro has outlived them all. Generations of American presidents, Soviet leaders, CIA directors, assassins. But history's final verdict about him has yet to be made. For a small eternity, Fidel Castro played an important supporting role in world politics. As a rebel, a womanizer, as a statesman. But even revolutionary leaders can't live forever. What remains of Fidel Castro in particular is his myth.